getting on for 2 weeks ago that I filmed the review for the Royal Enfield Interceptor 650, and I thought since it was a bike review I'd best pull my old 4K action camera out of storage and put it into use. Now, I've always been a bit of a Sony fan, and the FDR X1000 was the first 4K action camera that Sony produced about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, Sony have always been famous for their digital stabilisation on cameras, going back I think well over a decade. But when this camera was brought out, as 4K was still a relatively new concept and hardware hadn't quite caught up, camera stabilisation wasn't available. Now, I figured that if I body mounted the camera, I should be able to get some usable footage. But when I actually reviewed the footage later that day, I was really disappointed with it. As it turns out, I didn't use much of it at all, and I did even add some stabilisation in post-production, but the footage was still noticeably jerky. And so I decided it was time to update my action camera. Now, for me, the GoPros are out. They have a reputation for overheating and cutting out at inopportune moments, an indication to me that the software is demanding far more than the hardware is capable of producing. And the digital stabilisation available on the current GoPro Hero 7 is only the equivalent of the kind of stabilisation technology that Sony were using like 5 years ago. Now, the Sony FDR X3000 is regarded in most circles as being top of the pile when it comes to action cameras. But again, there are one or two issues. The action camera market peaked about 4 years ago, and it's been in a steady decline ever since. And the Sony X3000 is now, I think, about 3 years old. It has a fantastic combination of Zeiss lenses and Sony's market-leading sensors, coupled with optical stabilisation, which, it has to be said, is the ultimate in camera stabilisation systems. But as I've said, that model is now 3 years old. Sony have sort of lost interest in the action camera market because the money isn't there. The camera itself has next to no manual capabilities, which is something I do demand from a camera, even an action camera. And then there's the price. Because this camera is regarded so highly, it's possibly the most expensive action camera on the market, at round about £430. Now, this channel just swallows money and I get very little of that back, so budget was a major factor in choosing a camera. As some of you may be aware, about a month ago DJI released the DJI OSMO Action camera. DJI are one of the world's biggest camera manufacturers. Okay, they're known more for the drones, but their professional line of Zenmuse cameras are widely used in TV and movie making, and there are very few big budget productions that don't use them. Believe me, you see footage from those cameras just about every day. And not only that, they recently bought out Hasselblad, which is arguably the most prestigious camera company in the world. So when it comes to making cameras, DJI have excellent credentials, and the DJI OSMO Action is only round about £330. Now, I know that's not exactly pocket change, but believe me, for a high-end action camera, that is well below the average price. I thought long and hard before making this video. Everybody and the dog has done a first impression video on this camera. Most of the initial reviews were paid reviews, and they were all very positive. And then a week or two later, a lot of the same reviewers came back and rubbished it for various reasons. So this video isn't a technical review of the DJI OSMO Action. What I want to do is just dispel one or two myths and complaints from my experience of the camera, and actually put the camera through its paces on a motorcycle to see how it fares, because after all, that's why most of you are here watching this video now. The focus on functionality of these action cameras has changed in recent years. The original concept of what they were to be used for, extreme sports, has shifted, and they've now become regarded as a general purpose pocket camera in an effort to reach a wider customer base. And in that respect, DJI are no different from anyone else. The most notable difference from this camera to all other cameras on the market is that it has two screens, one at the back, as you would expect, and one at the front. Now the front screen isn't that important to me, although I can think of one or two scenarios where it may come in handy. But for your average biker who can only take one camera with him on a trip or on a day's ride out, where he's going to want to use this camera as a helmet cam and take selfies of himself and his mates when he gets to his destination, that front screen is a definite bonus. This camera doesn't come with a waterproof housing because it doesn't need it. The actual camera body itself is waterproof to 11 meters. So you're not going to have to worry about it if it rains while you're riding your bike and you've got your camera attached. The specifications and the sensor size are all very similar to the GoPro Hero 7. So in that respect there's no marked difference. Just like the Hero 7, there's an app available, DJI Mimo, that will allow you to do various things with this camera, as well as changing the camera settings. But where this camera does stand out as being slightly different from the rest is the digital stabilization. Now, I'm not quite sure how DJI have achieved it, but what they call rock steady camera stabilization is the best digital stabilization I've ever seen on an action camera. I can't confirm it, but I suspect that what DJI have done is used a sensor of a greater capacity than 4K, which is something that they've done with the Mavic 2 Pro drone. This allows them to crop in further than you would normally be able to do with a 4K sensor. And looking at the way this stabilization works, I would judge that it's probably up to a 20% cropping in order for the software to stabilize the image and still maintain a 4K quality. Either way, as I've said, it's the best I've ever seen. The footage that you're now watching is from the DJI OSMO Action, and the footage was taken under what were probably the worst set of circumstances you can put an action camera through. Motorcycles are fast moving things. This means that the processor has to work extremely hard to capture fast moving detail in the foreground, and if you look at either side of the fuel tank, you'll see that apart from normal motion blur which you would expect, there's no smudging or artifacting of the road surface, and that's pretty impressive. Now, I had the camera set up on a chest mount, which isn't the best way of mounting a camera on a bike, but it's not the worst either. But to make matters worse, I was riding the Bobber Black, which has quite possibly the worst suspension you can come across in a bike, apart from no suspension at all, which again makes both the camera stabilization and the processor work very hard. And then to make matters even worse, it was a really dull, dark day on the day of filming. In fact, at one point it even started raining while I was filming. Action camera sensors are tiny and they don't cope very well with low light. The camera was set up on full auto, 100 megabits per second data transfer rate at a frame rate of 25 frames per second. And on top of that, I've not done any enhancement or colour grading, so this is about the worst footage you could possibly expect to get out of this camera, except possibly riding the same bike in the dark. On the whole, I'm really impressed with it, because these were challenging conditions for any action camera. Despite the low light, there is plenty of detail in the image, although there is a little bit of noise due to that low light. And I'm sure that in brighter, clearer weather, I'm not going to have any problems matching the quality of this footage in with the footage from my other cameras. If anything, it is maybe just a little over sharp when you look at the horizon where the bushes and trees meet the skyline, but DJI are very good at releasing firmware updates to sort these sort of things out, so I have every confidence that they will give the option of altering sharpness in the future. Now let's just go over some of the criticisms that have been laid out on this camera, because I think people have been quite unfair. First of all, the video file container used for recording the footage is H.264, a tried and trusted container that I've been using for many years. H.265 is now available, and yes, some action cameras use the H.265 codec. It is more efficient, it is better at retaining detail in a smaller file, but it's also very power hungry when it comes to downloading it onto your computer. And unless you have a bang up to date computer with a reasonably high spec graphics card and at least, I would say, 16 gigabytes of RAM, chances are you will not be able to play those files, let alone edit them. So at this moment in time, H.264 is the more sensible file system to be using. second complaint levelled at it is that it's copied camera stabilisation from GoPro, and I really don't know where people are coming from with this. Sony and the likes of Panasonic actually pioneered this type of camera stabilisation, and they were using it in cameras over a decade ago. GoPro were very late into the game and only introduced it I think 2 or 3 years ago. Most video camera manufacturers now utilise some sort of video stabilisation, digital stabilisation being the most common. And I think that DJI have copied GoPro by incorporating this stabilisation into their cameras is a really silly comment to make. Also, it's been said that DJI have copied the form and design of the camera from GoPro. Now, GoPro didn't design that shape of camera. They simply, in the early days when they first started off with the video cameras, bought in a number of generic Chinese cameras and had GoPro stamped on them. These generic Chinese cameras had simply been a copy of your standard everyday compact camera, but in a miniature form, something that's been around since the 1950s. So I don't really think there's any copying gone on as such. It's just a tried and trusted design that everyone is using. Wide-angled lenses. Another thing that this camera has been criticised for is that it has a field of view which is more in keeping with a standard video camera rather than an action camera. Again, to me, this is just ignorance. The original action cameras didn't have image stabilisation. So if you used a lens that gave a narrow field of view, camera shake would make the footage unusable. The way the manufacturers got round this in the early days was to put an extremely wide angle lens on. So although you still got the same amount of camera shake, the effect from the viewer's perspective was minimised and the footage looked much more stable. With the advent of camera stabilisation, that's no longer required. So in the case of DJI with this camera, they've made exactly the right move by substantially narrowing the field of view to provide a more conventional image. I really wish people would do a little bit more research and look into these things before making derogatory comments like that, because to viewers that don't know any better, those sort of comments will devalue this camera in their eyes, and that's unfair. Battery life is good. I'm getting just over an hour out of the battery, and I have to say I am very pleased with the Osmo Action. It is the perfect camera for biking, absolutely no doubt about it, and I'm looking forward to putting it through its paces this riding season. I'll leave a product link for Amazon in the video description down below for anybody who might be interested in buying one. As I say, DJI have priced this product just about right. I think it undercuts most of the competition whilst giving pretty much the same performance. If you're in the market for an action camera and the Osmo Action fits within your budget, it's well worth consideration. Right, that's it for this week. I'll be back again next week. Once again, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Until next time, ride safely, and I'll see you soon.